Thanks for joining the webinar today. I know that there are people funneling in still. So just before we begin, I'll take care of some housekeeping items. Thank you again, guys, for joining Strengthening Cloud Security, a comprehensive approach. Feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window at any time during the presentation. Depending on the question, we'll either answer verbally during the webinar via a text response for everyone to see in the Q&A panel, or during the Q&A session at the end. And then if we run out of time, I promise I will get back to you guys over email or whatever contact you used to register. So the other frequent question that we usually get is whether or not we will have slides and the recording available for after the webinar. The answer is yes. The recording and the slides are going to be included in an email after the webinar. So if you can think of any questions, though, after the webinar, you can always reach out to us at info@horizon3.ai. So with that, let's begin. So if you, just to start with introductions, I'm Brad Hong. I'm the Senior Technical Product Manager here at Horizon 3. My background is I used to do, unsupervised machine learning for anomaly detection. Worked at Darktrace for about 6 years, did some contract work doing behavioral sciences for insider threat with MITRE, and then some other security contract work in the past. And then over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Brad. Hi, my name is Josh Foster. I'm one of the attack team technical managers here at Horizon 3. My background is mostly doing offensive cybersecurity capabilities for Title 50 organizations within the US government. Then I did some government contracting for a while before landing here at Horizon 3. Since being here, my focus has mostly been on expanding our Active Directory and Azure attack capabilities. Over to you, Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob Gouet. I'm an attack team technical manager here at Horizon 3. I have a background in compliance, cybersecurity, a lot of experience in pen testing. I worked at several different pen testing firms, and kind of have expertise in AWS and web application penetration testing. In Horizon 3, I've been pretty dedicated on adding AWS attack content, researching um, new new methods and attacks and integrating them into the product.
Awesome. So we're going to launch a quick poll here. Would love to see, what the reason for joining is today. Whether it is that you're a Node.js user and you're just interested in hearing about some of the new stuff that we have, if you're generally just a practitioner, or if you're just an executive looking for additional solutions to improve your team's effectiveness. So I'm going to cover the agenda while you guys vote in the poll. So for today, what we're going to go over some introductions, high level about both the company itself. We're going to cover a little bit of the difference between black box and gray box testing, as well as utilizing different perspectives to get the most comprehensive approach to pen testing autonomously. And then we'll focus more centrally on cloud security and then how to take that comprehensive approach for cloud security using Node Zero. And then, of course, we'll finish it off with discussions and use cases about infrastructure attack surface from the internal and external pen test that we have, as well as showing you guys through the AWS and the Azure Entra ID pen test directly in Portal from the very attack team engineers who built the content. Cool. So you can close the poll now. So if you, it looks like the majority of us here today are Node Zero users, but there's a little bit of a mix of folks who just want to hear more about the solution in general. So that being said, if you look into the history of where we come from, our background. The company is founded by former nation state hackers from the US Special Operations community, and they quickly identified a problem with the traditional approach of manual pen testing. When it came to protecting critical national infrastructure, ultimately, it was too slow to produce results, likely to little to no follow-ups, and it's extremely resource intensive when it comes to the scoping, the configuration, statement of work, and even the work required to fix the vulnerabilities themselves. So this then adds up to pen test limited in perspectives, use cases and relevancies, essentially an outdated checklist of vulnerabilities that need to be fixed with like little to no context, leaving security teams even more confused in a sea of priorities. And tragically, sometimes even looking 6 months to a year into the past instead of the latest exploitable vulnerabilities, which is constantly in motion. So then the problem sort of persists when you take into consideration the legacy tool approach of managing vulnerabilities using fingerprints of assets and services to run a service check of the possibility of vulnerability, which leads to false positives when considering for actual exploitability, or oftentimes simply just become a waste of time for the whole team during remediation efforts when they realize even if you exploit it, there's going to be little to no impact to the organization and its sensitive data. So at the end of the day, right, attackers aren't going to be waiting for you to verify these theoretical findings. They're not going to be waiting for change control requests, and they certainly will not respect the scope from a statement of work. And so they're going to try every tool under the belt to try to get in further and further. And so enter Node Zero, a world leader in autonomous pen testing. So what we're doing is we're utilizing AI machine learning algorithms to essentially drive the decision-making engine. And Node Zero applies machine speeds to its combinatorics so that it can assess every single possibility and highlight every attack path an attacker could take to expand their blast radius and impact, right? So by leaning into this speed and the diligence of the machine, what Node Zero enables organizations to do is quickly launch pen tests, as many as you want, as concurrently as you want, and then produce results of all exploitable vulnerabilities alongside proof of impact, and then highlighting tactics, techniques, and protocols or procedures even used to escalate it further into the organization's digital infrastructure. And so by measuring then the level of impact to the organization, essentially, what an attacker could do by exploiting a vulnerability or a chain of vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and findings like credentials and hard-coded cloud secrets, teams can then assess, right, the true priority of fixes needed for vulnerabilities and openings relative to their own organization. And so unlike a human pen tester, we're not going to pwn you and then go see you next year. What we offer, right, is we continue to give you this white glove service via our customer success team if you're unsure about certain attack techniques. But also we've built functionality directly into the product to allow your team to run smaller scopes of tests and to validate that the fixes that you made before or after a test essentially become a central tool in validating your security tools and controls. And so if you think about then the different flavors of pen testing, right? So the gradients from black box, gray box, and white box essentially just means how much information you're giving the actual, in our case, the software, but in the case of a manual pen tester, the pen tester themselves. So it's things like prior knowledge about the credentials, what services you're running, et cetera, et cetera. By default, the flagship model of Node Zero, the internal pen test, does operate with a black box perspective, right? We have no prior knowledge except for maybe open source intelligence if you provided it. And then everything else, like once you start to inject credentials and all that, that's when you start to land more into the realm of gray box and white box pen test. What's interesting then is it's imperative, right, to think about the fact that gray box, black box, black box, gray box, white box pen tests are not just a matter of gaining a cheat code to get more findings within the pen test, but really rather acknowledging that real attackers are almost always equipped with a credential when they're about to actually attack an organization, and then validating controls that you have against that specific visibility, right? So if you think about then the different flavors, plus where you position the deployment, so the starting point of node zero, that takes on the assumed breach. And whether you start from workstation or the domain controller, they will obviously offer different insights about the architecture based on the visibility provided from the assets, right? And then that all comes together to become a unique perspective to an attacker. And so it's just as important, right? So when you are thinking about cloud security, the big thing here is, and we're going to launch another poll just to get a sense about what kind of cloud environments you guys are using. But the complexity of managing cloud environments is pretty unique because based on the poll that we've seen from a Ponemon Institute survey, there was 98% of companies are using some form of cloud computing somewhere in their organization. 92% of these organizations are operating multi-cloud environments, which means that they have to manage cloud identities unique to each vendor, configurations unique to each, and then security controls unique to each as well. And so each vendor's unique approach, right, introduces distinct vulnerabilities, but also immensely complicates the task of securing hybrid environments. And where it gets even more interesting is later on, the study reads that only 20% of these companies actually have a dedicated cloud security team, which then magnifies their concerns of data loss, data privacy, and then accidental credential exposure. And so blue teams who do not have specialists will struggle to prioritize and address cloud security tasks, often overlooking critical vulnerabilities. And then the unknown attack paths and exposure that we see, major threats include the overlapping workloads, unclear responsibility divisions, social engineering attacks, and then lack of visibility in multi-cloud deployments themselves. So despite the zero trust strategy, organizations often face breaches, right, due to unrecognized pivot points between public cloud instances into private or cloud instances into on-prem and vice versa. And all of this is often frequently exploited, especially with Node Zero, without using a single MITRE CVE, right? So what are we doing about that? So considering that 45%, I believe the statistic is, of breaches are cloud-based, costing, I think, an average of like $4.1 million for organizations. Microsoft also introduced a pretty interesting statistic stating that 4,000 password attacks occur per second that target Azure identities, which ends up being like assessing cloud security beyond just the external perspective of what can an attacker see without gaining initial entry into the organization. And so what we've come up with addressing cloud pen testing specifically is purposely taking a layered approach using continuous testing to take on the different perspectives that serve as reality to what a real world attacker would be, right? So our company is founded on using offensive techniques, using the attacker's perspective to inform defensive measures. And so some of the must-haves, whether or not you use Node.js for cloud security, has to be continuous security validation. So it's not just a matter of using a CNAPP or a CSPM to say, theoretically, we simulate that these are controls that you have. We think that you would be vulnerable to X, Y, Z. That's kind of going right back into that same vulnerability management aspect of it, which is just using fingerprints and servicing data to think about theoreticals instead of actually trying to utilize the attacker's technique to get in, you need to have flexibility in deployment and positioning, because if you're utilizing the same pen test over and over and over again from the same perspective, sure, you're going to find a lot of stuff, and then you're going to start to be able to cut down on the amount of impact that you see immediately as low-hanging fruit. But more importantly, it's going to start getting a little bit stale, because there's going to be last mile assets or visibility that you want to be able to cover, and you want to purposely inject different flavors as well as different positions in the organization to make up a pen test series, so that you know for a fact that everything, from end to end is covered, and you know exactly what your pivot points are. Then the other three is, yes, it is important to have a product that is hyper focused on assessing cloud native weaknesses specifically. But what we think as an attacker is even more important is identifying the ability to chain together attacks and loot from across the entire digital infrastructure, whether that's on-prem, SaaS, cloud, your printers, IoTs, whatever it is, and demonstrating what an attacker can actually do with seemingly unrelated assets throughout the organization, and then demonstrate that blast radius in context of the entire organization. And you'd be surprised how often, when we get into internal pen testing, from an infrastructure attack surface perspective, we will see things like hard-coded secrets in, like an asset or a server that nobody thought would have anything to do with cloud, or even weak or default credentials that we were able to identify scattered throughout the environment, and then leaning into some of the features of like Azure Entra ID or AWS to utilize the same credential in a cloud environment, right? So where it gets really interesting is, this is an example of an internal pen test. What you'll notice is, again, remember that we're leaning in on the machine speed and the combinatorics here, which means that Node Zero is never going to forget some of the things that it saw initially, right? So when Node Zero was deployed internally, what you're seeing here is, earlier on, like 13 minutes into the pen test, we identified and we saw that there is an AWS role called audit over here, right? So subsequently, after about an hour and 45 minutes into the pen test itself, we identified an exploitable Log4Shell device. We were able to exploit it, discover or dump secrets from the actual host itself, amongst which we were able to get AWS access keys. We were able to chain that together with a different AWS role that we were able to see, assume the role, and then you'll see here that this is just us leaning into the weaknesses of AWS's identity and access management. And then from there, we're going to go, oh, wait, I remember that we also had this audit role. And so we will attempt to do the same technique and see if we can assume a role up here using the audit role, in which case we can. And so this is a really good way to then understand, when you cast a big net across the entirety of your digital infrastructure, just how an attacker might be able to put together context clues or exploit their way into additional secrets and credentials that are commonly used in the organization to escalate themselves even further, whether it's via lateral movement or privilege escalation. That's what we're looking for, right? And then the external pen test, of course, these types of attacks originate from our cloud infrastructure, which means that this is about as black box of a pen test as it gets. We have no prior knowledge. We start off with an external asset discovery. Based on the asset discovery, we will then go and authorize, and then you can pen test these assets purely from an external attack surface perspective, right? So this is in the same way. Once we had deployed Node Zero from our cloud instance, what we did was, using OSINT data that we have, we were able to find the company's LinkedIn page, pull potential users, and then Node Zero is keeping that in the back of its mind. It will try to utilize some of the potential users that it saw. So again, this is type of information that's available to attackers today. From this perspective, right, we were able to password spray our way in, and then create an Azure token, and then eventually escalate into the actual cloud environment as an Entra user. And so for us, it's really just a matter of understanding, right? What can you do from various perspectives? And so for the cloud side on the Azure and Entra ID side, I'm going to pass it over to the attack team technical managers, and they can take you through why they built it the way that they did and what they're looking to cover with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. So AWS Pentest. So what I think it's good to go over like what are the motivations for this pen test. Many of you might already know, like we've been doing AWS attack content for several years in the product. Node Zero has had the ability to find credentials hidden in files and utilize those credentials to conduct enumeration, other attacks. We've also had the ability to look for S3 buckets, public S3 buckets, assume roles anonymously. Um, and we've even had the ability to inject credentials, either user keys or inject via running node zero on an EC2 instance an EC2 instance assigned a role. So we've had a lot of AWS attack content. The motivations for adding this pen test, this AWS specific pen test is one of them is easier deployment. We have you'll create a cloud connection, which gives us privileged access inside your account, and that's the starting point for the test. And there's a little bit of legwork the first time setting it up, but every time after that, you're able to run AWS pen test and just by selecting the same cloud connection you create. So you can create it one time and then use it every time after that. You can also set up cloud connections in all of your different accounts and run a pen test against all of them at once. But I think the more important reason for adding this was to take advantage of the privilege role in your account to conduct a gray box penetration test. Brad mentioned it earlier and was talking a little bit about the different perspectives. The gray box perspective is really useful here in the AWS realm because it gives us increased visibility into your account. It lets us see what exists in your environment so that we can be more educated in the attacks we conduct. And I'll go over some examples later of that. And then the other huge part that the gray box pen test allows us to do is we can analyze IAM, identity and access management. So we can read all the policies and permissions, as well as see what users and roles are assigned those permissions and find weaknesses inside there. So first, I'd like to go over to the cloud connections and kind of talk about what those are. So you can navigate to them down by clicking the pen test dropdown. You'll also find that if you try to run an AWS pen test, and you don't have a cloud connection set up, it'll have a link here. So you can jump to the cloud connections page. And then you can click create connection. So here you'll put your cloud connection name. So you can put your friendly name here, dev account or prod account, however you want to describe your account. And then you can put your account ID here. And then you can go ahead and click submit. And here I already created one before this demo with that same account ID. If we put a different ID in here, submit, and we see the account just created in the background. And then there's a couple different deployment options. Both of these are using AWS CloudFormation, which is kind of like AWS's version of Terraform. But these are pretty easy to use. You just log into your AWS account, and then you'll click the launch stack button, and it'll be all pre-populated, ready to go, and you can click deploy. And then after that, you can verify the connection, and that sets up this long-lived connection in your account, which the AWS Pentest can then utilize. So then you might be wondering, okay, so what kind of results are we going to see in this AWS Pentest? If we jump over here, here's the sample op, which is available to all customers to kind of look at and see an example of what an AWS Pentest results could look like. We jump into weaknesses. The first thing I'd like to highlight is here we see this public access to Amazon S3 bucket. This is a perfect example of the strengths of having this be a gray box pen test. Here, the cloud connection that was set up was able to read all S3 buckets, or was able to see all the S3 buckets. And then Node Zero went about saying, hey, what of these buckets could be accessed publicly? Like who on the internet can access these buckets? So it went ahead and did that and found two of the buckets in this account are accessible, are publicly accessible. And these are kind of weaknesses that you're not going to see often from a black box pen test because um, if these bucket names aren't guessable or if you can't find the bucket name like in the Git repo, then a black box pen tester simply can't that doesn't have the knowledge of the bucket names to see if they're public. Whereas here with the gray box, we see all the buckets. We'll find every single bucket that's public. If we click in here, we can kind of see the attack path here. We see here's the cloud connection, and then we see public S3 buckets. So we utilize the cloud connection to see the buckets, but then we actually we accessed it. So here's a cross account. So this is and a user in another AWS account is able to access the contents of this bucket. The next weakness I'd like to highlight is we see here this privilege escalation attach user policy. Here we see the proof description. The privilege user is able to escalate permissions by attaching the administrator access policy to the privilege user. So this privilege user is not an administrator, doesn't have full permissions, but it was assigned this permission, the IAM attach user policy permission. And with that permission, it is able to add the administrator access policy to that user set of permissions and then effectively become an admin. And this is able to be done because Node.0 can read all the policies assigned to the users, does the analysis, and says, hey, this looks like a weakness. And then we actually use this simulate action. There's a simulate action Python script, which is using the AWS's simulate action API, which allows us to say like, essentially Node.0 says, hey, I'm pretty sure this weakness exists. Let's formulate this command and send it over to the simulate action API. What if this privilege user ran this CLI command and in response we find yes, that's possible. This user can add that policy, and that permission to do that is found in this privilege user attach user policy policy. So here, if we look at the attack path, we see the connected role, we see the cloud connection found this user, and then here we see the policies assigned to this user. So these are all the policies. Here we can actually look and we see the permission right here. I'm attach user policy, which is what Node.0 found that looked like a weakness. And then here we see the simulate action. The action being simulated. And then here we see the permissions after. And if you scroll down here, you can actually see the administrator access managed policy being added, making this user an admin. This is another example of the strength of the gray box pen test. We're able to use that privilege command to analyze IAM and to find these privilege escalation attacks that exist. The last thing I'd like to highlight is if we go in credentials here, we can see this EC2 user data secrets target user. And if we look down here in the attack path, we see the connected role, and then we see the discovered credential. And what's happening here is the cloud connection is finding every single EC2 instance that exists in that account and is looking at the EC2 user data assigned to each instance. The user data is essentially a startup script that the EC2 instance has. It's essentially a startup script, and inside that startup script, you can have different configurations or keys set up. And so in this instance, we looked at this, Node.0 looked at this EC2 instance, looked at the user data and found some AWS keys in that user data, and then pulled those AWS keys out, and then was actually able to use those keys to log in and verify, and we find these new user keys. This is another example of some of the advantages of this gray box AWS Pentest. Yeah, that's it for demo of the AWS Pentest. Over to you, Josh.
Cool. So for the Azure Entra ID pen test, we kind of took a little bit of a different approach, simply because when you're using Entra ID, your default user actually has a lot of permissions, a lot of read permissions that we can use when doing a gray box style pen test such as this. So instead of having to build up the cloud stack that Rob mentioned, we simply just kind of ask for a user to be injected into the pen test. So it's got a little bit of a different flow here, from the identity attack service, Azure. So right away, you'll see we actually run the Azure Entra ID pen test from your on-prem Docker host. If you're familiar with Node Zero, you know that we run our internal pen test are run from an image, a Docker image that you run on a host within your own premises environment. So for our Entra pen test, we decided the only scope we really want is your domain controller. And this is to really just kind of take advantage of Node Zero's SaaS platform, really, and lets us test any of your hybrid misconfigurations that are very popular is not the word, but like they're we see them all the time. So we really wanted to make sure that if we did an Azure pen test, that we were able to highlight all these misconfigurations that allow attackers to kind of cross that cloud and on-prem boundary. So we'll actually be able to highlight some of the attacks that we have going from on-premises to Azure, and actually going from Azure back down to compromising your Active Directory domain. So the only scope we really ask is for the domain controller, and we also require a privileged domain credential. If you're familiar with our Active Directory password audit, you're familiar with that we need a credential that has what's called DC sync privileges. Essentially, it is an account that is able to synchronize credentials off of the domain controller. There is a nice learn more link here that'll take you to our documentation that can show you how you can create the least privileged user for that, for Node Zero to utilize, rather than just giving us full domain admin. So what that allows Node Zero to do is do what's called an NTDS dump. That's basically like it's a domain controller replication call to the domain controller. It says, "Hey, give me all your creds." So we're able to perform that dump. And that kind of gives us key pieces of information. What it gives us is if you're using Entra Connect, or what was previously known as Azure AD Connect, within your Active Directory environment, we're able to kind of locate that server and go after some attacks for Entra Connect. It also gets us what's called the Azure Seamless SSO machine account. This account is used if you're using Azure Seamless SSO. It is used to sign Kerberos tickets to access Azure resources, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into that as well. It's kind of a little bit technical to talk about at the moment, but that is why we kind of ask for that privileged credential, is so we can kind of show and highlight those hybrid attacks without you having to spin up an entire internal penetration test at this time. And then finally, we ask you to inject an Azure credential. This can be a hybrid user. This can just be a normal Azure user. It's just a username and password. And this is where Node Zero uses that starting point within your cloud environment. So it's going to look to see if it can take this user and escalate its way up to global administrator and what we call the full tenant compromise. So that's kind of the setup of the Azure Entra ID pen test. Dive a little bit into some of the results that you'll see and some of the impacts from these particular types of tests. This is a really cool attack chain we've seen a couple times in production in customer environments. It's actually really neat. So you'll see here, we injected that administrator user and we injected that clear text user. That is an Entra credential. So we pretty quickly identify the Entra Connect server, and we're able to gain local admin on that machine and do what we've dubbed Entra Connect dumping. Derek Yan has a really great research paper on this technique. Essentially, their Entra Connect maintains its own database of credentials that are encrypted and further encrypted using the PAPI and LSAS credentials. So we're able to kind of take all that and decrypt a credential for this Sync AZ user. So if you're familiar with Entra Connect, they have two accounts. One account lives in your Active Directory, one account lives in your cloud, and because it's in this kind of privileged position where it's synchronizing credentials between the two, it needs those privileged credentials. So we're able to kind of grab the creds for that sync user off that server. And then from there, we're able to exploit what's called an application takeover and service principal abuse. So after gaining that initial foothold via Entra Connect into the Entra environment, we're able to kind of identify some applications or service principals that we're able to attack. So we're able to see that this user in particular can add a credential to this Cyber Azure role dev service principal. And once we're able to kind of add a credential to that application, we realize that that service principal is overprivileged. Like he's got privileges that would allow us to create a new user and then to elevate that user to the global administrator. So that's kind of what you see at the tail end of this attack chain. And then another one that I really like to highlight is kind of our silver ticket abuse, which is really interesting. So once again, you see we injected these two users, and then we get that Azure AD SSO ACC $ account. Sorry, that's a mouthful. But that's the Azure Seamless SSO machine account. So if you're using Azure Seamless SSO in your environment, it's real handy to kind of let users, once they log into the Active Directory on premises, to let them log into the cloud resources without having them type in their credentials again. That's the reason they exist, right? And the way that Microsoft decided to implement this was good old Kerberos. So if we're able to kind of compromise the machine account credential for that service, we're able to forge tickets and log into whatever we would like. So in this instance, you see Node0 does an Azure Hound data collection, and it discovers that this hybrid admin user exists. And it realizes, hey, this hybrid admin user is not only a global administrator in the cloud, but he's also synchronized down to the Active Directory. So we're able to forge a silver ticket for him. And Node0 is able to do that and log in as the global admin. What's kind of really cool about this actually is a really interesting way that we've been able to get around MFA a lot, pretty often, because a lot of places will have conditional access policies in place that allow that, hey, if you're logging from on premises, we're going to trust this machine. And because we're running Node0 from that on-prem environment, it's automatically trusted, and we don't get prompted for MFA. Now, those are kind of two really neat ways that we've been able to go from on-prem to the cloud. But what's really neat is we're also able to go from on-cloud to premises if we have in the right circumstances. So in this example, you see we got our global administrator credit injected and our Entra user. But what we're able to determine using that global admin is that this environment has what's called Kerberos Cloud Trust enabled. And this is another method Microsoft uses to allow on-premises and cloud to talk to each other. But if you're a global administrator, you're able to create basically a rogue or fake device within the Entra environment. So we're able to create a fake device, register it with the tenant. The tenant then gives us what's called a primary or fresh token. And that token is for our user. And because we can now use this token to create Kerberos tickets to log into on-prem resources. So we're able to kind of extract the NTLM hash out of that ticket and use it to gain domain administrator access. So it's really neat. I probably did not do the best job describing it, but it's actually a really cool way that we've been able to go, hey, we've compromised your cloud, but we haven't compromised your on-prem yet. Let's give that a shot. So it's actually really neat. Now, I got one question here from Sean. How does the Entra ID Pentest handle strong authentication, or MFA, or whatever Microsoft calls it these days? So right now, we don't really have the MFA support. Right, it's just username, clear text credential. Now, the very next thing a wise person is going to ask is, hey, Josh, Microsoft's going to auto-enable MFA for everybody in October. Well, luckily we've got the roadmap planned out that we're going to start enabling um, some MFA mechanisms for when you inject a credential, or possibly be able to register an enterprise application within your tenant for Node Zero. So those are all things that are to come. I promise we'll have a solution for your MFA before October, before Microsoft hits that button. Um, so looking forward to that. That was a good question, Sean. Um, and I think that's about it for the Azure penetration test. So back over to you, Brad.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. So some of the key takeaways from today is no matter how you guys end up pen testing any environment, whether it's cloud, on-prem, hybrid, whatever, from an attacker's perspective, most important is layering the perspective and using, all the tools that you have available to you. Because if you think about it, if you're in a room of 100 blue teamers and you ask them, how many of you guys researched the latest attack techniques? You might get a couple hands here and there. If you ask a room full of red teamers, how many of you guys are up to date with the latest defensive techniques? Everybody will raise their hand, right? So for the threshold for the subject matter expertise is definitely higher when looking into these kind of perspective. And what's important for you to do then is to constantly use the offensive perspective to inform your defense, and then use that as your primary mechanism for for driving use cases of what if, for example, I had an insider threat. Their credentialed, their privileged perspective, right? So it's important then to recognize that it's not just a matter of scoring points to get a clean perspective. You want to find as much as possible so that you can either de-risk it, you can mitigate, remediate, or you can say, this actually does not matter that much to me. And by taking the different perspectives, you're benefiting in different ways where, black box for me, the coolest part about Node Zero, both internal and external. And for Emmanuel's question about like the unauthenticated black box, like what you're looking at is, how can an attacker, with the context of every asset that I have in my organization across various vendors and openings and public facing, private facing, blah, 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 how can they take context clues, findings, loots, whatever, and then chain that together to get the highest impact possible, as opposed to gray box, which is all a matter of validating that the defense in depth that you guys have painstakingly planned, scheduled, created, and put controls into place is actually working. Because it's one thing for an EDR, for example, to say, hey, you're potentially vulnerable and they're supposed to mitigate. But it's another thing for you to look at the proof found in our portal and see that we still managed to get away with hard-coded cloud secrets, for example. And so, all in all, I think it's just a matter of keeping the templates and the series fresh so that you're constantly incorporating different types of use cases that are, in actuality for real world attacks. So thank you guys again for joining. I was hoping to give you guys a little bit more time for Q&As, but now is a good time to ask any questions. Please feel free to jump into this link. We will again send out the slides and the recording later on. And then for those of you interested, we are having another webinar coming up via a colleague of mine, another PM, and she's covering the new product incoming called Tripwires, which will be specifically for a threat detection. And we'll let her get into the good stuff then. No, so we definitely should have mentioned, Sean. The all the cloud pen testing stuff that you saw, essentially the identity attack surface, the identity attack surface category is included within the Node Zero license that you have today. So all of this, like again, because we believe that this is a very important thing to have a comprehensive approach to cloud environments. It's not going to be like an additional license for that. Awesome, guys. Well, we are at 1:45 Eastern. Thank you again for joining. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us again.